Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Sydney, and I'm going to be hosting the Science Cafe today. Thank you all so much for being here. So our topic today is the origins of life, and we have three wonderful guest speakers who are going to be sharing their perspectives on this topic. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce them in a minute. Before that, though, a little bit on our format. We're hoping that today is going to be just a really interactive conversation about this topic, and it's really going to be based around audience questions. So at any time, if you have a question that you'd like to ask to one or multiple of our speakers, please go ahead and use the Q&A function in Zoom to do that. The chat is disabled and we're not going to be calling on people, so please submit your questions through the Q&A, and then we're going to get to as many of them as possible because we're really excited to hear your input. So to jump right in, we have three speakers today who are all going to approach this interesting question from different perspectives. So our first speaker is Dr. Ron Breaker. He is the Sterling Professor of Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology and a Professor of Molecular Biophysics and Biochemistry. Our second speaker is Dr. Pincelli Hull, who is an Assistant Professor of Earth and Planetary Sciences. And our third guest is Dr. Mary Evelyn Tucker, who is a senior lecturer and senior research scholar in religion and ecology, and the director of the Forum on Religion and Ecology. So thank you all so much. We're so happy to have you here. First, I'm just going to ask you all to give a slightly more thorough introduction and tell us a little bit about your work. Dr. Breaker, would you start us off?
Yes, thank you, Sydney. So my name is Ron Breaker. I'm a professor in biochemistry here at Yale, and my laboratory studies some of the most rare and odd functioning RNA molecules that we know to exist in biology. And our research in part is aimed to understand how modern cells work, how modern cells use RNA molecules, the distant cousin of DNA, to do everything from catalyze reactions to code for information. And we want to understand how bacteria work using these molecules in order to do things like develop novel antibiotics or to understand the evolution of these bacteria. But every time we uncover these mysterious RNAs, we get a chance to sort of cast an eye back in time to see what biology was like several billion years ago. And some of those insights give us a bit of knowledge about how life got from its very earliest stages to where it is today.
Thank you so much. Chelly, would you introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Chelly Hall, as you so kindly introduced before. I'm an assistant professor in Earth and Planetary Sciences, and I'm also an assistant curator at the Yale Peabody Museum in invertebrate paleontology. But in terms of what I actually do, I'm a paleontologist and an oceanographer. So in other words, I use fossils to reconstruct what life has done in the past, particularly in the ocean. And in my laboratory group, we really are interested in how things like massive environmental change relates to the history of life. So my expertise, ironically, is extinctions. And when you think about the history of life, perhaps the surprising thing to think about isn't how much diversity in life survives today, but it's the fact that nearly everything that's ever lived has died. 99% or more of species that once existed are now gone. So our story is as much a story of what persists and what novelties come along the way as it is the initial spark of life itself. And I guess the fun fact to take away from my research, the way that we address questions like this, is that when you get far away from land itself, the bottom of the ocean is actually made up of tiny fossils from plankton. So if you were to like walk on the bottom of the ocean, you don't walk on dirt, you walk on tiny fossils. And those fossils really capture a lot of information about the environment and their chemistry and about life itself and their shape. And so my group really focuses on extracting that information. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you. Mary Evelyn?
Thank you, Sydney, and all the organizers and my fellow panelists. I'm Mary Evelyn Tucker, and I teach both at the School of the Environment and the Divinity School, and also have an appointment in religious studies because my background is a historian of religion, especially the religions of East Asia, China and Japan, and especially Confucianism, which doesn't have an origin story, by the way. But in addition to trying to study with the Forum on Religion and Ecology, which is 25 years old, how religions and culture can contribute attitudes towards nature of care and concern and respect. We have another project, my husband and I, John Grimm, called Journey of the Universe. And that's a project to help bring the immense discoveries of science, as we've just seen with our colleagues here, into a larger public. And so we did a film called Journey of the Universe and a book that Yale published, and a series of conversations with scientists and environmentalists to try and understand this extraordinary unfolding process, a immense 13.8 billion year journey. So all of that's available on Amazon Prime, along with the conversations. And that's where I'll probably be speaking from more on the origins through that lens, as well as some of the origin stories from the world's religions.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to have this combination of expertise to talk about this topic. To jump in, I think I'm just really interested in hearing what your field says about the origins of life, what possibly even competing theories exist about how this might have happened. So I think Ron is going to start us off with this.
Yeah, of course, we all know this is an incredibly difficult question to address. Through the eyes of scientists, there are many possible ways in which one could imagine life could have gotten its first spark. And I think one of the challenges that we see with modern scientists using modern methods to try to address this question is that people begin to deconstruct what we know is alive, right? If you define a cell as being alive, okay, we know the components of the cell, and then you try to break it up into parts and ask how each of those parts might emerge. So you have some researchers who might argue that you need DNA first in order to have something that's alive. You'll have others that will argue RNA. By the way, I'll be very clear about this. I'm a big fan of the RNA perspective for the origin of life. But others will argue, no, you need the bag that you keep all your molecules in order to be alive, which is going to be some sort of a cell-like membrane. And so you have origin perspectives depending upon which polymer or which component of the cell you want to hold up as the most important for modern cells. And it creates a lot of diversity of ideas, but a whole lot of disagreement as well. And I would argue that at this point, there is no single compelling scientific argument to favor any one of the hypotheses that are out there at this point.
That's so interesting. Thank you so much. Shelley, do you want to jump in and add anything from your field?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons why we were so excited to have Ron go first is that when we think about when life originated, it originated before our first rocks. So I think one of the shocking things, if living on land when we're surrounded by rocks, and a lot of those rocks are sedimentary, which just means that they're made up of other bits of rocks. So they're telling some history of a time period before, is that as you go back into Earth's history, there are fewer and fewer rocks. And that's because one of the things that makes our planet habitable is that our planet is a giant recycling factory. Because of plate tectonics, rocks that come up go back down again. And that's wonderful because that means it keeps our carbon cycle in a nice balance that we can all live in. It's a good thing. But it's terrible because it's recycling the old rocks. And so by the very first time that we catch a first sedimentary rock, which is, let's say like right around like 3.8 billion years old rock, there's chemical trace evidence that life is already around at that point. So we actually can't catch with fossils this earliest origination story. So, if if the planet itself is about 4.5 billion years, life is already around by that first rock that we get. And I think a really remarkable thing to think about is that these early microbial, and Ron was hinting at these early, like very molecular, on the border of life, not life systems are around for a very long time compared to the complex life that we're used to today.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So interesting. I didn't really know much about the age of rocks, so I'm so excited to hear more about that. Mary Evelyn, what about your field?
Well, I'm going to just speak briefly about this journey of the universe, which we brought out actually 10 years ago here at Yale, and with an incredible conference with scientists and humanists and so on. But there we were trying to say something even much larger than this fabulous molecular RNA origin, and I'd be happy for Ron and Shelley to respond. But some people are also looking in the non-science world, you might say, but to where are origins coming from even beyond this molecular level? Like at the Natural History Museum, the Hall of Earth speaks about the deep sea vents and possibly that life originated there. So as well, a theory of a comet hit the Earth and that helped ignite life. So the big theories are also of great interest, as you know, to a larger public, and some of that we put in Journey of the Universe. And in the conversations we had Ursula Goodenough from Washington University talk about this origin of the cell, which is extraordinary. Maybe it took 1 billion years for the first cell to emerge. And she speaks about, does a cell actually have life by replication and have a sense of its self, shall we say? Is a very, very interesting interview. So those are sort of big questions from a general public. But I would also say, and maybe in another round we can go into this in greater detail. So if we move to the religions and origin of life, it's so striking that you can't speak about origin of life without speaking about the origin of the universe. And of course, our scientist friends here would no doubt fully agree with that. But it's absolutely striking that many traditions are concerned about cosmogony, the origin of things, the creation stories. But I do want to emphasize that it's the Western traditions that have a creation God and a Genesis story, as we have in Judaism and Christianity. But other traditions, like the East Asian traditions, have a sense of ongoing creativity in these processes without an origin moment or an origin God. That's true for Confucianism and Taoism in particular. Jainism also, Buddhism, ongoing creativity. But that life does emerge after, as we know, more than 10 billion years even of universe evolution and so on. And that sense of preparation for life to emerge is something that I would say religions are also very interested in, even in their creation stories and their myths, the 7 days of creation in Genesis, etc. So we can talk about that maybe in a little more detail. And final point, though, is I think we do need to state the obvious, is that creation stories or even ongoing creativity, the sense is nonetheless that the religions are looking for meaning, for orientation to the world and how we fit in. So I'll come back to that topic in our next round.
I would love to dig into that more, because I feel like there's a really interesting analogy to science, which is, right, what is the impact on scientific investigation to think about an origin story versus sort of a long scale continuation of life? I'd be really interested to hear if Ron or Shelley have any responses to any of that.
Yeah, I think I should pass this over to Ron, but it ties in when Mary Evelyn, you were mentioning like, okay, like where did life evolve? So even if life evolved and it's encoding its information in RNA, which is what Ron was describing, the idea that it is, so there's, what components of life makes life first is one part of the story. And then the question is, where on the planet did it come to pass? And so it's almost like two parts of the problem. And the reason why people lean on vents, or potentially some people think maybe near the surface with lightning strikes, is because you somehow have to go from simple to complex molecules. One of the cool things about the early conditions of the Earth is it's actually conducive to building up really pretty complicated little bits of molecules. And that actually makes it a lot easier for life to evolve. So that's the first step. And then the question is, okay, did you get stuff as complicated as RNA all on its own? And then you just have to swallow it up in a little lipid bubble? Or do you start the complex information transfer first? And I think that's where Ron, what Ron might have been alluding to. I should probably pass it back to you to get into the details, though.
Yeah, there's so many things to say just from the comments that have been made. I think we all agree, we're all puzzling over this, really profound question of where we got our start. And part of the problem, I think, as Chelly hinted at, is that the Earth is a great eraser. We're losing information from our rocks over the billions of years since the origin event occurred. And in fact, some of those simple organisms just don't fossilize very well, and we might not have good evidence even if we had some sediment or some rock to look at. But unlike the physical objects, which can get erased over time, as we all know, biology stores information, and Darwinian evolution indicates that nature over time builds upon that information and changes it, distorts it over time so that organisms can adapt to new surroundings. But we believe there are some components in biology that are super ancient. In other words, if we can understand them in organisms today, we can understand a bit about how those early organisms operated. Problem is we can never see all the way back to that origin event, that information might be lost because it just was too long ago and those organisms were too different than what we have today. And just maybe to close by saying that my laboratory, we don't examine fossils in the classical sense. We study what we think are molecular fossils, where we use computer algorithms to identify these mysterious RNAs that are still, by the way, with us today. Some of them are hidden in the genomes of organisms that surround us, and that we can understand the information present in those molecules. We can understand what their functions are, and then we can begin to build a better picture of what life was like very early. Again, the problem is that evolution is erased pretty comprehensively all the way back to the origin event, and we're still stuck. And that's why we're having this kind of a meeting today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, well, I just was going to say, like, some of the the reason, it's hard to imagine that, the deepest history gets erased, perhaps. But part of the reason why we imagine that some of these earliest origins really probably got wiped out is that as life began to evolve and became more diverse, certain transformations to the environment probably made the planet pretty tough to live in for organisms that came before them. And so, like, one of the major transformations that we have is the origination of oxygenic photosynthesis, which sounds way too technical, I know. But if you look outside your window today, all the green stuff, all the plants are taking light and taking CO2 and making effectively sugar. And that is actually pretty crazy if you think about it. And if you look at the molecular machinery that they use to do this fancy trick, it actually is really ancient and conserved. So this is that sort of molecular fossil that Ron's talking about. And so even though the molecules that they use were abundant in this ancient ocean. And so we can actually tell by, like, some of the things that our body uses aren't that abundant anymore because of the way the chemistry of the whole planet has changed in the meantime. But we can look at these ancient, molecules or these ancient processes that are trapped in organisms around us and see that today. But when oxygenic photosynthesis came about, what happened was all of a sudden the atmosphere got oxygen. And the reason why everybody runs around these days and eats things like blueberries, right, because they're worried about antioxidants and pomegranates, is because oxygen is actually really toxic to life. And so as soon as oxygen came around, it changed the planet in many positive ways. It allowed for all this energetic life that we see today, but it actually probably was a horrendous mass extinction for a lot of things that lived before, or it pushed a lot of organisms into sort of anoxic refuges like our gut. So that's why you get this sort of erasure of some parts of the history of our planet through time.
Wow. Following up on that idea of remnants or evidence left behind on Earth, we have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Hull. Mads asks, what are those early traces of life circa 3.8 billion years ago that you mentioned? Are they certain proteins? Are they a mineral that we know indicates the presence of organic matter? And what methods can be used to detect those traces within rocks?
Yeah, so the most definitive thing that we like to look for in the fossil record is a body fossil, and body fossils come along a couple million, 100 million years later. We get our first definitive body fossils. So we have them trapped in cherts, the actual fossil prokaryotes. So that's the most definitive, we might say. But early on, we actually have isotopic signatures, because what happens is, if you think about it, life, everybody has their preferences, and everyone knows that we need certain nutrients to grow, but it also turns out that our cells actually find certain isotopes easier to use than others. So taking you back to high school chemistry, a different isotope is just something like oxygen that has one more or one less neutron. So it has a different weight, and that makes it go through your cellular machinery faster or slower. So life actually preferentially fractionates. It preferentially takes up one isotope and another. And so some of our most helpful global signatures through this early Earth time period actually come from a lot of different isotope systems that have traces of life's impact on the whole planet.
So interesting. Thank you. Thank you.
Could I just say something quickly here? Because I wanted to pick up on both Ron and Shelley's point a moment ago. To say the obvious, it's so fantastic to hear scientists who can convey this very complex research in ways that we can all understand and appreciate. And what I want to signal here is that the deep dive, the molecular dive, from the smallest to the largest that we're getting now from science, from the microscope to the telescope, I think evokes in humans a sense of wonder and awe, right? Because of this complexity, because of what we're beginning to understand that even 50 years ago, we certainly didn't understand. And what I want is just to invite us to think about, you see, is that awe and wonder obviously evokes respect. And even out of this understanding, we can move towards a much more common sense of care for our common home, and so on. So I just wanted to make that point: wonder, awe, respect, even reverence and care, just from a scientific point of view. And then I just wanted to make a quick point about how metaphor, and this includes literature and all the humanities, but metaphor through literature and the arts and religion and philosophy also helps the human mind take in this type of complexity. Lauren Isley was an amazing writer at University of Pennsylvania, The Immense Journey, and picking up on photosynthesis, which I think is one of the great, astonishing creative moments in evolution. He talked about how flowers changed the world, and he got us to imagine what that meant in terms of the explosion of green life and then the color of flowers, which we're all loving right now. So again, we've got the science, we've also got metaphor and story to appreciate our planetary home. It's very, very exciting.
Absolutely. And that actually relates to a couple of questions we've gotten about single versus multiple origin events. I feel like we're all sort of awed by this idea of a single origin event and fixate on that a little bit. And so I wanted to ask you, are there scientific theories that there have been multiple origins of life? And are there religious traditions that think about multiple origin stories?
Maybe I'll say something about this issue because I think, other than knowing exactly how, inanimate chemistry gave rise to life as we know it today, I'd love to know how many times that happened on this planet, or if you were to travel to Mars and find a separate origin event there, that would be incredibly meaningful to know how many times and whether it's, in our adjacent planets as well. Because if it's more than once, or if it's even early on this planet, as Shelley implies, that suggests life might be quite easy to launch. And that's really exciting because then it's not a super rare event, a 1 in a trillion chance, and we just got lucky, but that life might be elsewhere in the universe in great abundance. And that, as a biologist, that's awesome. There's endless opportunities for study of interesting chemistry and biology out there. So I think that's an awesome question to address. Now, I don't even think we have to go to Mars to take some serious shots at this question. For example, if there was a separate origin event on this planet, let's say 2 events, and that they started out fundamentally different chemistries, unless our form of life drove the second form of life to extinction, that life might still be with us, and we just either haven't looked for it or we haven't recognized it in some way. And so this idea of a shadow biosphere, something that's different than us, living next to us, maybe super rare, maybe in a specialized, geologic compartment that we haven't accessed yet, it would be awesome if that were true. But we'd have to be prepared to find it and recognize it once we saw it. Knowing the answers there tells us a lot about the probability of life elsewhere in the universe.
Yeah, and I love that. And just from like a theoretically possible perspective, both options are possible. Like when it comes to, like, we think oxygenic photosynthesis, this incredibly important thing, we think it evolved once. Well, but we have other examples of super complex things that if you get the right precursors, they evolve again and again. So for instance, a good example is it's going to sound too technical, C-force photosynthesis. It's a type of photosynthesis that a lot of grasses do today. It allows them to deal with the stress of having relatively low CO2 compared to deep time. And there's evidence from one of our colleagues here at Yale, Professor Erica Edwards, works on it. There's evidence in that group that they've evolved this really complex pathway multiple times. So, and there's experimental evidence from another person named Professor Richard Linsky, where he shows that if you get the right precursors, you can cause complex things to evolve again and again. So I don't know if we know.
Yeah, and I think from those are great answers. The point of view of religion, partly because creation stories are often transmitted orally. There are multiple stories often, even within indigenous peoples. The Hopi have various stories of origin coming up from the earlier worlds into the fourth world, and in part because humans messed it up before. But the Hindu tradition has a number of stories of Vishnu as a prime mover, if you will, and Brahman as a creator, and Shiva as a destroyer. So you've got this sense of the ongoing creativity, actually, and destruction of things, which comes back to origin. And they certainly have a huge sense of kalpa and time of this creation and destruction in Hinduism. But I think also I just wanted to come back to this notion of how people need to think metaphorically and symbolically about these things, because we need meaning. We're meaning-making creatures, and why our origin stories so contested. I just wanted to put this into the mix here. And I would also say, by the way, that evolution is particularly contested here in the US, not in other parts of the world. Asia does not have the same issues, so we want to make sure we say that. But I want to put into this mix is that without a sense of meaning and purpose, and I think we see this in many people, young people right now, that this narrative of evolution, be in its big scale or in its origin of life scale, needs to draw the human in with the good science, the clear science, and also the sense that things are not fully settled, but that we're part of something large, vast, complex, and ongoing in terms of evolution. Just wanted to put that in there.
Absolutely. I think that gets at a question of sort of communicating with the public, which relates to one of the questions we have. And I think I'll maybe point this one towards you, Dr. Breaker, because you had mentioned something about assessing life on Mars or other planets. Someone asks, what would you accept as evidence of life on Mars? Would it look like body fossils? Would it look like certain molecular evidence? And do you think that threshold would satisfy the public if it isn't what we typically think of as life?
Yeah, again, these are very hard questions. Some of them maybe have more than one answer. I think the Mars question, let's say we were to send a probe to Mars to sample some material, which we have. We'll eventually gather that material and launch it back and study it here on Earth. But when you start talking about transferring materials from one planet to another, this concept of planetary protection comes in. And NASA and other space agencies around the world are actually quite concerned about making sure that if we're bringing samples back to Earth, we're not bringing some form of life back that would be damaging to our own ecosystem. But that planetary protection issue goes both ways. In other words, we don't want to send spacecraft out and land them in special areas on Mars and take our microbes with us so that when we are prepared to study whether life is there, we get fooled. We brought it with us, right? And so there are all sorts of ideas on how to defend against that. Sterilizing spacecraft. Also, to analyze, we can analyze the biological contamination that's present on the spacecraft. And then if we collect material on Mars and look at its DNA sequence, and it looks like what we saw in the clean room on Earth, well, then it's contamination. So those issues of contamination, which by the way, we've already done, we've already put microbes outbound to Mars. Mars has global dust storms. We've blown spores all over the place on that planet. So in order, I think, for a scientist to be convinced, and I'm hoping the general public is skeptical as well, if you're going to claim novel life on Mars, it better have some fundamental differences from life on the planet. It could have been that billions of years ago we traded biology by meteor fragments or what have you. But then those should be deep branching organisms. In other words, evolutionarily, they should look very different than what we see here on the planet. Hopefully, it will look completely different. Or maybe one of my favorite scenarios is it has a lot of the same mechanisms and molecules as we do, but they're in the mirror image configuration. Instead of the types of amino acids we have, they're the mirror image version. They can do the same thing, but it's just mirror world. They look different than us, and that would suggest a different origin.
That's so interesting. I'm sensing some hints of some sci-fi inspiration here.
But it's
no, I have
real.
I have to say, like, the recent Mars research, though, I have to say, like, and it's probably because I'm far away from it, but I have to say, like, I'm getting more and more hopeful that we will find life there, because we're getting the right components and the right hints of what the early Mars looked like, really, because it probably was a more habitable place earlier in its history. So I have my fingers crossed. And geologists are also quite involved in thinking about traces on other planets, because life does impact, as I mentioned, isotopes, but it also impacts the structures that rocks form, which seems crazy, but like even like the way a sand pile gets formed, or the way that a river moves across the landscape is influenced by having organisms around that. So there's a lot of different ways of trying to peek at it, but I agree that to finally say definitively, you'd really like to see the type of evidence that Ron's talking about.
If I could just jump in here, thanks to both of you for that and for the question. And I know next week you're going to be speaking about some of this as well, exoplanets and so on. And all of this is exciting for many, many people. I just want to come back, though, to Chelly's research, about extinction. And I think that very few people, and love to hear Chelly's response at first, but I think very few people in this country or elsewhere understand that we are in a 6th extinction period. And so the value of life here is so extraordinary. There was a very special webinar yesterday with Jane Goodall and the leading cardinal at the Vatican, and the Vatican is really trying to weigh in about biodiversity and its value and so on. So I think the sense of loss of life, which, as you say, 99% earlier has disappeared, but this cause we know is human cause, not like an asteroid or something like that, and that is very, very troubling for people who realize it, understand it, the sense of loss, sorrow, even mourning. So this conference coming up in Kunming, China, on the COP for biodiversity, I think is a very important moment to weigh in about origins and the continuity of life in this lost time. But back to you, Chelly. Love to hear your response.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a working from home issue. Do you guys hear the background noise, or are you all right there? Okay, I will continue then. Yeah, I guess 2 parts. You're right that like we're in a major crisis in our own biosphere, and at this point in time, Earth has been called biosphere 1, but it's our only biosphere. This is the only habitable planet. And while I love the creative ideas about going to Mars and making an outpost, the reality is we're having trouble keeping our own planet in this nice, easy to live in for humans space. And it's only that much harder on another planet that hasn't been essentially terraformed, completely remolded by life for billions of years. Life, when we came along, we evolved into the Earth as it was. And so we're very nicely situated to live in an intense, glacial, interglacial interval in the dynamics and the time period that we live in. So this is our biosphere. I have to say, from a historical perspective, the origin stories I've always been drawn to, I do like the Hindus, because this idea of creative destruction, we see that in the fossil record. We see cycles of destruction. We see, major mass extinction events. So the reason why people call it the 6th mass extinction is because there's been 5 major mass extinctions before. There's actually been way more mass extinctions as a whole, but people tend to focus on the 5 really big ones. And the positive thing when you look to these mass extinctions, or if you think about the ones even deeper in time, is that insofar as we know, not once since life first evolved has it ever gone completely extinct. So that's comforting. I find that comforting for life. Like we haven't done that. And that's actually amazing. Our planet has stayed in a really narrow temperature range and habitability range for billions of years. And that's amazing. But that said, you usually lose everything that's dominant gets lost during a mass extinction event. And so if we're in a major mass extinction event today, there should be a sense of I experience a sense of profound, there's a sense of loss of what's here now. But I also worry as a human, because we are dominant on the landscape, and we're evolved to live in the world as it was before we arrived. So I think there's a very human problem to be considered with biodiversity loss too.
Thank you.
Absolutely. I want to pivot a little bit because I think Dr. Tucker's last comments about the sort of large-scale perspective sparked some really interesting questions about the relationship between religion and spirituality and science when we think about some of these questions. So Michael asks Professor Tucker, how does modern science relate to various origin stories? Are there areas of affirmation? And to Professors Breaker and Hull, has your research influenced your spiritual belief systems or vice versa?
Okay, so maybe I'll jump in and they can think. So that's a great question. We did a conference up at the Chautauqua Institution, upstate New York, a wonderful a place for a week long. They have many, many conferences, and this one, Brian Greene was a major speaker and so on. But our week-long conference there was to consider this question of how other religions would respond to Journey of the Universe, which is a telling of the story with this sense of awe, wonder, our responsibility for its continuity somehow, but without necessarily an overt religious tone at all. And so all of those are online, the responses of scholars from the different world religions. We did a conference at Yale Divinity School on Christian responses to Journey of the Universe. Several hundred people came to that. There's a book called Living Cosmology, and that all the responses are there. So what I want to say is, this is an excellent question. It's not simple, but it is also to say that this is why I'm trying to emphasize metaphor, symbol, which is so essential to the way humans take in knowledge and meaning and purpose. Science has a very different methodology, empiricism, and so on, which has brought us to new levels of understanding. The explosion in 150 years since the origin of species of Darwin is just astonishing. So I think one of our greatest challenges, though, is to help this weave between this symbolic, spiritual, meaning-making thrust of the human and science and what it is offering. And I think we're still a bit in two silos. That was Stephen Jay Gould's view. But a book like Braiding Sweetgrass of Robin Kimmerer, who's a botanist and a native Potawatomi, that book has sold over 100,000 copies because she's trying to say we need the scientific knowledge for ecology, and we also need indigenous ways of knowing. And that is happening all over the world. I could say a lot more, but that kind of weaving is really, really important. Maybe wonderful. Ron and Shelley want to
I want to hear if Ron and Shelley have anything to add. Do you think your work is contradictory with sort of creation or origin stories, and or does your spirituality play a role in your work at all?
Maybe we can say complementary instead of contradictory. But
Sure. I'm quoting a question a little bit, but yes, absolutely. I want to leave space for either perspective.
Shelley, go ahead.
Yeah. So the question is, has my work changed my spiritual beliefs? And I think no, it hasn't. But at the same time, I think what ties science and religion far more tightly than most people appreciate, but what Mary Evelyn, I think, is hoping to get people to hear, is that we are all captivated by a sense of wonder where we live and why we're here. And they're, I see them as two different ways of knowing the world and the universe. And so even though my work, that makes me a fan of Hinduism, for instance, I'm like, oh man, I wish I could be like this recreation, rebirth thing, because I totally see it, but it hasn't just fundamentally shifted my spiritual perspectives. But I think there really is a false dichotomy between the sort of passions that drive a person to investigate the world scientifically, and the passions that drive you to understand it through art or through spirituality or through community. I think they're all different ways of knowing the world.
Yeah, maybe I'll just say a few words here and then get people to think beyond the discussion today. I feel like I'm a fully vested scientist who uses almost every waking moment thinking about how to forward the mission that we have as scientists and to explore the natural world in the best possible way we can. And I had mentioned earlier about RNA molecules at one time perhaps dominating in biology, and I mentioned this idea of a mirror image world that might be elsewhere in the universe. I want to combine those two for a moment because I think there could be developments in the field that force everyone to ask some serious questions about science and about their views of how life got started, and in fact to guard against some possible problems. For example, I believe that about within probably 5 years, maybe less, maybe more, researchers will get to a point at which they've made an RNA molecule in the laboratory, fold up, and if given food, if given nucleotides, they will reproduce. And so in a sense, that's life Mark II. That's an origin event made in a laboratory. Now, if we make those RNAs look like the RNAs that are in our bodies, then that's just going to be food for us. We could consume those, we would digest them, no problem. But if you made that RNA molecule out of mirror image nucleotides, the building blocks of RNA, now you've created a mirror image RNA molecule that can reproduce and is not food for existing life. In other words, if you fed it, that organism is going to continue to grow, it's going to evolve, and we will have a parallel form of life as primitive as you might imagine in the early days of life on Earth. And we have to think about how we might use that, what we might do with it. Are there any dangers to that? And does that change the way we view the world? Because now researchers in a laboratory have the power to create new life forms from inanimate chemistry.
I would just say that one of our problems is we have no precautionary principle here in the States, especially. Europe has a bit more of it and so on. But the ethics of so much of this is just way behind what's already happening in the sciences. And but I would just offer a precautionary principle and at least some thought about these issues. I'm sure Ron would agree, is most welcome.
It would be a wonderful discussion to have in a forum like this.
Yeah,
I think that's, and think of, that's amazing. Like I actually didn't know. I knew that there's also a lot of work on sort of completely doing a whole synthetic cell, which because that's actually pretty easy, the wrappings in a sense, right? So I think another thing that sort of starts to blur the boundary too is that there are these, there are new molecular tools like CRISPR-Cas and gene drive, where you can actually start to innovate and spread things in a way that we haven't really faced in the past. So I think that's fascinating, Ron. I didn't realize we were that close to to fully synthetic life.
It is. It sounds like you all have come up with a whole new science cafe topic that we're going to have to explore in the future.
I would just say quickly too, geoengineering, which is very much on the horizon, will probably, the unknown consequences of it are enormous. And I know many scientists, including Tom Lovejoy, our colleague at Yale through YIBS, is not in favor of it. But this is part of the precautionary principle, how we're going to deal with climate change and these immense problems. Sorry, back to you, Sydney.
No, this is absolutely amazing. I want to be mindful of time and close us out in just a moment here. Do any of you have any final thoughts that you want to leave the audience with? No pressure.
No pressure. Ron, Shelley, and me. Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. I was just going to say to everyone, stay curious. It is really fascinating how far back in time researchers can reach with all sorts of methods, classic sort of paleontology all the way to modern molecular studies. Stay curious. It's really a fascinating story.
Yeah, I think I'll ditch my message and can go with Ron's here. What's maybe difficult to appreciate from the outside is that science is advancing incredibly rapidly right now. There are a huge number of living scientists using incredibly cutting edge techniques, and we're rapidly pushing forward the bounds of how we understand and manipulate life. And so this sort of conversation is important for the ethics side, so for so many questions and problems, but it also means that we have such powerful tools to understand life's origins, but also change its direction and its future. So, so stay curious and stay involved too, because it's really important we all do this together. We're on the same planet.
Yeah, I just want to say what a pleasure to be with Ron and Shelley and Sydney and your team, Dave. You're doing such great work. And I do hope that this kind of conversation will continue. And I just want to offer, at Yale, there's an effort that's been growing for the last 5 years on environmental humanities. It's actually exploded because humanities are so strong at Yale. And I think somehow if we can build on this dialogical spirit, this conversation among academics, but also include non-academics in the conversation, because I think this public outreach for science and humanities and ethics is absolutely essential. So thank you so much, all of you, for initiating and creating the context for this conversation. Thank you.
That's wonderful. Yeah. To close us out, I want to say thank you in return. I'm so grateful that you all were willing to come and have this conversation and let us ask you challenging questions. I also want to thank all of the Yale Peabody staff who helped to make this happen, and all of you in the audience for spending your lunchtime with us. As some of the panelists alluded to, there's going to be a second conversation with some different guests about life on other planets, sort of continuing some of these concepts. And that's going to be on May 10th. So look out for announcements and information about that. Additionally, feel free to follow the Peabody Museum on social media or sign up for the email list if you want information about more events like this one. So with that, I just want to say thank you to you all and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a
Bye.
lot. Bye-bye. Keep up your great work.